When I was 18 months old, I was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. And for those who may not know, cerebral palsy is a chronic disability where the mobility in your body is limited in all of the predominantly physically functional extremities. And for me, the biggest symptom was extreme tightness and stiffness in my muscles. And so when I was diagnosed, my doctors told my parents some pretty devastating news. First and foremost, that I wasn't supposed to be able to eat. And that was largely in part because of the stiffness in my chest. It wasn't going to allow me to swallow or digest food. I also wasn't supposed to be able to talk because I didn't have enough core strength to produce vibrations. Wasn't supposed to be able to sit because I couldn't isolate the top half of my body from the bottom. I had no core strength, I couldn't hold myself up. And I most definitely was not supposed to be able to walk. But there I am walking down the aisle in an Indian wedding. But my parents, they were pretty cool, and they refused to accept can't. Ever from a young age, they've been telling me to go forth unafraid. And when it came time that they wanted to help me with this process, they knew right from my diagnosis that they were going to go to the ends of the earth to make sure that I had as much access to as many different treatments as was available to me. And by the time I was 3 years old, I had already had a pretty major hip surgery in which my pelvis was so stiff that it was pushing my femurs out of their hip sockets. So I had to have that repaired. And the recovery was very strenuous. I was an inpatient in a rehabilitation center for about 3 months, and I was receiving over 20 hours a week of physical, occupational, speech, and food therapy. And then one day, I was about three and a half years old, my rehab specialist came to us and recommended an entirely new, back then seemingly unconventional type of therapy for me to try. That was therapeutic horseback riding. So, you can imagine my parents' faces when my doctor told them that I should try, therapeutic horseback riding. They thought to themselves, yeah, sure, I'll put my tiny, physically impaired daughter on top of a horse. And I'll paint a picture for you. They look like deer in the headlights. And nonetheless, they continued with this go forth unafraid attitude, and they let me try. So my dad and I went to the old Claremont stable on the Upper West Side, which is actually closed now. And when we arrived, the on-site physical therapist said, all right, Lauren, here's the horse you're gonna ride. And down came Volton. This is Volton. He resembles a rhinoceros much more than a horse. He's bigger, taller, thicker than a Budweiser Clydesdale. So my dad once again adopted that deer in the headlights face and said something to the effect of, well, I guess Lauren's gonna be the first person ever to ride a horse on her knees, because there was gonna be no way that I was going to be able to separate my legs enough to sit on him, because back then I couldn't separate my legs at all. They were one. My brain treated them and recognized them as one entity. So I approached Volton. My dad I imagine he was shaking, and Volton comes over to me, sees me from all the way down there. I was only 3, you can see I was tiny, and stuffed his head into my arms. And I fell in love with horses right then and there. And then it came time to actually ride the horse. And the physical therapist on site helped me to stretch and warm up. And then they said, all right, we're gonna lift you up on the count of 3, so just try your best. And 1, 2, 3 came, and with no physical, chemical explanation to date, I separated my legs for the first time ever on my own and sat on that horse for a 30-minute lesson, upright in the saddle. And that was my largest physical milestone to date. After that, it wasn't long till I was walking. And at age 7, I actually graduated from therapeutic riding programs and went on to riding alongside able-bodied individuals at recreational stables. And in the summer of 2009, I actually started to show. I showed in the Long Island Horse Show series for riders with disabilities. We call that Lazard. And I showed in their beginner equitation division. So I was riding by myself. And I competed in some shows here and there, and I did well. But then we got a call that I'd qualified to compete in year-end finals at the Hampton Classic Horse Show. So I thought, I'll definitely do that. Went, and ended up winning reserve champion on a horse named Debutante. So then, completely in love with it, I thought to myself, all right, well, now this is serious, and now I'm gonna try and be the best that I can be. I took the next 6 years off from showing and worked as many weekends as I could, took as many lessons, and really worked hard to improve. So I went from being walked around in a circle in a therapy program to learning how to walk and trot and canter and even jump independently. So I came back the summer of 2015, went back to Lazard, competed in some shows, qualified again for the Hampton Classic, and this time instead of reserve champion, I came back and won grand champion for the year. And this was on a horse named Just Keep Swimming. And in fact, this past August at the Hampton Classic, I came back again, qualified for the advanced independent division, and I won the grand championship title again on Opportunity Knocks. So riding has been a very pivotal force in my life. In addition to all the immense physical benefits, there were also the emotional ones. And the last horse I'll introduce you to is my horse, Rusty. He's a 16-year-old Hanoverian gelding, and he is the love of my life. And I trained him in the summer of 2015. He was a dressage horse, and I trained him to be a therapy horse, and now he works for Gallop NYC. So once again, over the years, riding has really been a recreational outlet in where I can experience this freedom and this independence that I could never experience on the ground due to my disability. When I couldn't go ice skating in Central Park, I could ride. And when I couldn't keep up in dance classes at school, I could ride. So the physical benefits were great because you were practicing balance and strength. But it was the camaraderie in horseback riding, the partnership, the communication skills, those were invaluable. So I just told you a lot about myself, fun getting to know me, huh? And you're probably all wondering, how does this relate to courage? Well, first we need to ask ourselves, what is courage? And when we think of courage, we usually think of things that would hypothetically apply to everyone: jumping out of a plane, climbing Mount Everest, wrestling a crocodile, even riding a horse. And for me, the most courageous thing that I think I've ever had to do, the most courageous thing I think anyone would ever have to do, would be to learn how to accept their whole self. And the focus of my TED Talk now is going to be to answer the questions, what is it that courage means to me? And how does my experience inform that definition? How does courage manifest itself in my life individually? And so the main experience that I'm going through right now is just being a New York City teenager. And that definitely is not easy for a disabled person. Everything about New York City is dynamic, it's fast-paced. And so that makes keeping up both a very literal and figurative struggle. And I've noticed that the rate at which New York City teenagers can develop independence is pretty exponential. You see kids on the subway who are maybe 11, 10, 12, 13, they're riding the subway themselves, taking themselves to their activities. And it was always hard for me to accept that the reality was that independence was always going to be something that was hard for me. And sometimes it's even the most seemingly basic functional tasks, like putting on my shoes, opening a door. In other words, it's a lot like learning how to mount the horse in the first place. So as a kid, I really struggled with my identity as a disabled girl, because not only did I have to fight societal stereotypes of women as being fragile or dainty, I was also disabled, which has its own stigma. Lots of people are girls, not as many people are disabled, even though people with disabilities are the largest minority of people in the world. And there are much less people who identify as both. So I began to see my disability as a barrier. And I told myself that all I needed to do to be accepted, to feel accepted, was to just convince other people that I wasn't actually disabled. And to my 9-year-old self, that made perfect sense. I thought it was genius. The logic was clear. And the core of what was going on here, reflecting on it now, was that this was an issue of self-respect. I had learned to base my sense of self-worth off of how much approval I got from others, right? So my desire to win the approval was shielding me from ever seeing what it was that I needed to do to be my best self. I never wanted to use my crutches. I never wanted to ask anyone for help. I never wanted to wear orthotics on my legs. And there was a time in my life where I wanted to run everywhere, as if that proved something. So this denial of my disability, this kind of craving for validation from others, that all changed one day in a riding lesson. Now, I'm going to talk about falling off, so mom, cover your ears. Falling off is something that happens to everyone. It's not a matter of if, but when. And it hurts, and it can be embarrassing. That's universal. But what isn't universal is the kind of embarrassment that I've felt in particular of the horror and kind of pity that comes when a disabled person falls off. And for all the riders out there, if there are any, we're familiar with the way that trainers are when a rider falls off. The response is immediately, I didn't say you could fall off. Get back on, do it right, go ahead. And growing up, I always wanted that push. The hard part for me was when people were not saying those things, when they wanted me to stay on the ground. Now, this one day, I fell. Wasn't my first fall, but this one was different. The pony I was riding at the time, his name was JP, he and I had just started learning how to jump. And that was something I dreamt of doing ever since I was a little girl. And when I hit the ground, I did not feel a thing. That was because all I could focus on was one thought, and that was, all right, well, they're never gonna let me jump again. They think that this is too dangerous for me. I'm never gonna get any better than this. And as all amazing lesson horses do, he didn't run away when I fell. He stood with me, stood right above me, and he gave me a look that I will never forget. As I was lying there on the ground, feeling sorry for myself, trainers running at me and JP from every direction, he looked at me as if to say, all right, this was your fault. Cut the crap, get back on. I haven't even broken a sweat yet. And that changed me because suddenly I understood something really important. My horse never saw me as a disabled rider. He never saw my disability at all. And that's because when I'm at the barn, just enjoying what I'm doing, it's hard for me to do anything but just be myself. I'd become so immersed in the activity that I didn't have time to worry about the ways in which my disability might define me. All I could think about was how I was going to do my best and be my best self. So when the trainers got to me saying, oh my God, are you okay? I didn't give them the answer that I thought any able-bodied rider would give, which is what I wanted to be. I gave my own answer, which was something along the lines of, well, I'd rate the takeoff 9.5, the freestyle was about an 8, and the landing bit rough, so about a 6. And falling off taught me a couple of really valuable lessons about accepting myself that without riding, I may have never had the courage in the first place to confront. The first one is that being disabled is like falling off of a proverbial horse every single day. Now, you can choose to wallow in that frustration, in the frustration of not being able to do everything, of not always winning the approval of others. Or you can choose to remember that this metaphorical falling off is inevitable. And the only way to become a better rider, or in my case, a better girl, is just to get back on the horse. And in other words, being disabled is inherently part of who I am. And learning to embrace it is by far the most challenging thing I've ever had to do. But I know that I will become a better Lauren if I at least try. And I'm sure that we all have parts of ourselves that we're putting off, that we want to hide. And in a sense, these things are our disabilities. They don't have to be chronic ones like cerebral palsy. But we all have things that quite literally disable us from being our whole selves and wearing that whole selves on our sleeves. And we have to confront our whole selves eventually. In 1961, I did some research recently. Joan Didion wrote an article for Vogue, and it was about the nature of selfhood. and how we can locate our sense of self-respect. And in that article, she describes, confronting our whole selves for the first time. It's something that we all have to do eventually, like coming face to face to a vampire with no garlands of garlic at hand. And that's a great metaphor, because when we look inside, we're not always going to like what we see. It might look like a vampire to us. And we live in a society where everyone is constantly trying to innovate, to strive to do their best, to be the best. And so it's incredibly challenging for us all to acknowledge all of the things that make it harder for us to achieve, the things that might stand in the way of our ability to be the person that we want to be, but not necessarily who we are. And learning not to run away from that inner vampire, to accept our whole selves unconditionally, now that takes courage. Because self-respect definitely is not about saying these things. First, well, I've got all these flaws and I've made all these mistakes, but hey, what's a girl to do? That's not what self-respect is. Self-respect is also not saying, what flaws? Nope, silly goose, I have no flaws, I'm perfect, I love myself. That's not self-respect either. Self-respect and even courage for that matter is about saying, here are all of these things that are challenging for me. Here are my flaws. And I'm responsible for these things. I'm going to embrace all of these things and, all of these things that create and inform my experience, inform who I am. And now naturally, wearing my whole self on my sleeves is going to invite some embarrassment. And that's okay. I am going to go forward, and any mistakes I might make in the future, any embarrassment that might come my way, those are my own responsibility, and they're okay because they're true to who I am. To love my whole self and to have self-respect is to be disabled and to embrace that disability even in the face of great difficulty, to own it and to make it visible to others. But at the end of the day, when I'm lying down in my bed, I know that I have to make peace with that vampire within me. And for me, riding was a mechanism that I learned how to use as a way to embrace. It was an activity that showed me through patience and hard work that I can learn to actually work in symbiosis with my disability instead of denying it or working against it. And I think that we all probably have a proverbial horse in our lives that enables the progression of our sense of self. And courage, I would say, is not only learning how to ride that proverbial horse, but to absorb all that it can offer you. The brilliance of having authentic self-respect is that the figure of your true self ceases to be something that you need to run away from, but that you can run towards and with open arms. So I encourage you to all start moving in that direction. Thank you.